Very good evening, dear students. Welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy Current Affairs Analysis session. And today we have some very important topics for the discussion. And one by one we'll try to look into all these important topics and we'll try to understand them in a very detailed and comprehensive manner so that it will be helpful for your prelims and mains examinations. So the first topic with which we are going to start this discussion is about Indian startup ecosystem. So few days back we have already discussed about this because the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, particularly the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So Minister Piyush Goyal have actually made the comparison between the Chinese startups and Indian startups. So why Indian startups are not performing better in almost all sectors, but why they are limited to a few sectors such as e-commerce, food delivery, and most of Indian startups are focusing on these areas only, but on the other hand the Chinese startups are focusing on the cutting edge technologies. So they are innovative startups or innovation driven startups. And in fact, with respect to India, so technology driven, innovation driven, more diversified startup ecosystem is very important, but that is lacking. The context is that so Indian Commerce Minister sharply criticized Indian startups and the overall Indian startup ecosystem, because Indian startups essentially focusing on the consumer centric ventures. So what are these consumer centric ventures? For example, e-commerce, a consumer centric venture. A food delivery platform is also a consumer centric venture. So Indian startups are neglecting the deep tech innovation. Indian startups are not adequately focusing on the cutting edge technology based startups. So that is the main difference between Indian startups and also the Chinese startups. And Chinese startups are actually far superior when it comes to the Indian startups when it comes to utilizing the existing technologies, and they are the innovation driven startups. Right, so some data with respect to Indian startup ecosystem has been given. So it is being said that India has the second or the third largest startup ecosystem. So around we have a 20 so we have around 20,000 plus startups in India, and total valuation of Indian startups around 50 billion US dollars, and in fact 200 plus incubators or accelerator startups, and 9.5 billion funding since January 16th. Right, so these are the major centers or the urban centers of the startup ecosystem in India, whether it is Hyderabad, Delhi, Bangalore. So these are the major centers of new startup ecosystem in India. So going ahead, we'll be understanding what are the other problems that the Indian startup ecosystem has been facing. So it is being said that India has more than 100 unicorns. So what is a unicorn? So unicorn is a startup or a company, its total valuation is around 1 billion US dollars. So if its total valuation is 1 billion US dollars, and that particular startup is considered as a unicorn. And in fact, according to some data, India has more than 100 unicorns. So most of these unicorns are the startups which are concentrated in some specific areas, such as the e-commerce sector, a consumer technology sector, a digital payment sector, or online food delivery platforms. Right, so most of the unicorns have been just concentrated in these sectors alone. And apart from that, in the year 2023 alone, India has added around 20 unicorns. In India, there are around 20 unicorns in just 2023 year alone. Apart from that, for Indian startups, the government of India has also been providing the policy backing or the hand holding support, because we all knew that the government of India has launched a number of programs such as the Startup India program, Stand Up India program, Digital India program, and in fact recently India has also launched India Artificial Intelligence Mission. So there are a number of missions that are actually launched to boost the startup ecosystem in India, right? So in order to further strengthen the startup ecosystem growth in India, a 10,000 crore rupees 10,000 crore deep tech fund has been created, and in fact India even launched India Semiconductor Mission. So we even launched India Semiconductor Mission. So these are some initiatives or efforts on the part of the government to boost the startup ecosystem in India, to make it more and more tech savvy in nature, more tech savvy in nature, right? So that is how startup ecosystem is actually promoted, right? So that is how the startup ecosystem is actually promoted. So in fact over 65% of the population is under 35 years of age in India, right? So around 65% of the population is below 35 years of age, and that's why it is being said that India's working age population is very high compared to all other countries, and we also have a huge demographic dividend as well. So we even have a huge demographic dividend. So according to some estimate, so every year India has been producing around 1 million engineers. We have been producing 1 million engineers almost like every year. So we have all these advantages, and these advantages will potentially benefit India when it comes to establishing a healthy startup ecosystem, and this healthy startup ecosystem is inclusive in nature, it is diverse in nature, and it is not concentrated in very few sectors alone. Rather, the startup ecosystem, because of the inherent advantages that we have, should actually focus on number of areas. For example, the electric vehicle segment, electric vehicles, semiconductor manufacturing, space domain. So these are very important sectors that startups should actually focus on, and that is very important, instead of just concentrating oneself in e-commerce, food delivery platforms, or digital payments related startups, right? So inclusivity and diversity of startup ecosystems is very important for a country like India. Now it is being said that we have been producing around 1 million engineers every year. So 1 million engineers every year are produced by the existing engineering colleges in India, right? So we have the technical manpower, however we need to utilize that technical manpower in a right manner. And apart from that, in the field of technology, India is having a very good record. So when I say in the field of technology, India is having a very good record. So if you look at the global large global companies such as Google, Sundar Pichai, and Microsoft, Satya Nadella. So Indians are dominated in the domain of technology, right? So therefore it actually provides us an advantage to establish a strong and a robust startup ecosystem, which is driven by the technology, which is driven by innovation. So therefore there are emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, financial technology, right? So these are a number of technologies or emerging technologies where startups can actually engage in, right? So these are emerging areas, and they can also provide a huge opportunities for Indian startups. And in fact improving digital infrastructure. So in fact India has actually made a rapid strides when it comes to the digital payments, right? Digital payments, we have made a huge progress, right? So for example, UPI, Aadhaar, BharatNet, so they actually laid a foundation for startups to thrive in India. Now the startups can actually thrive in India because the government of India successfully implemented the Digital India program. So according to some data, India processed over 100 billion transactions in the year 2023 alone, right? So you can imagine how well established digital infrastructure we have in India, and that could potentially benefit new startups that are coming in India. And apart from that, there is a need to bridge a gap between the Indian startups as well as the Chinese startups when it comes to the technology adoption. And in fact, we'll understand some key issues which are actually plaguing the Indian startup ecosystem. And as we have already discussed, that Indian startups are essentially focusing on very limited domains, for example e-commerce and food delivery platforms, or even the fintech or digital technologies or digital payments, right? So they mostly concentrated themselves in these sectors alone, and they are not diversifying, and these startup ecosystems are also not inclusive in nature, right? So apart from that, low deep tech funding is also another major problem that Indian startups have been facing, right? So when I say a low deep tech funding, deep technology actually requires a good amount of funding to establish, right? So any such startup would require a huge amount of capital to establish itself and also sustain itself. In fact, startups which are based on artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or space technology, so they are actually getting a very less amount compared to what these startups are getting in countries like US and China, right? So in 2024 in India, only 1.6 billion is the total funding that these deep tech startups have got, right? So despite they are registering 78% of year on year rise, right? So this indicates there is a need for funding. There is a shortage in funding, and that has been plaguing these new startups to thrive in those respective domains, right? The first challenge is it is limited to few specific sectors. Second challenge is deep technology funding for new startups to establish themselves and also sustain and thrive in those respective sectors. And in fact, venture capitalists, we should also talk about the venture capitalists. And in fact, venture capitalists also play a very important role in any country where there is a thriving startup ecosystem, because startups require funding, and these venture capitalists provide funding to new startups. If venture capitalists found that this startup would grow enormously in future, then venture capital would start investing in these startups. However, when we talk about Indian venture capitalists, they are being considered as conservative in nature. And they are less risk taking, and they are not ready to invest in any startup which would likely give results after 10 years. For example, imagine that there is a startup, and this startup is working in the arena of space. First thing is that it requires a huge funding, and it also based on the long-term result or long-term sustainability or profitability of the space startup. But venture capitalists are not ready to invest in such startups which are long-term in nature or more than 10 years in nature, right? So that is the main problem, and Indian venture capitalists are also conservative in nature, right? So this is different from what US and China has been experiencing. For example, in US, venture capitalists invested in SpaceX. So they invested in SpaceX, but in India, venture capitalists are not ready to invest in Indian startups which are deep tech based, which are innovation based, which are technology based, and which likely give results for a longer periods of time. And similarly, another major problem that has been existing with respect to Indian startup ecosystem, Indian industry, is that there is a weak academic and also industry collaborations or linkages, right? So when we actually collaborate, when we have the collaboration between the industry and the academia, we will be able to produce workforce that can actually suit the needs of the existing industry, right? And in fact, there is also a poor research and development infrastructure. So India hardly spends just 0.64 percentage of its GDP on research and development. So therefore it is indicating that there is a poor state of research and development infrastructure or poor state of research and development in India, and therefore there is a need for the collaboration and there is a need for substantially increasing the research and development funding to these institutions. And apart from that, there existing several regulatory bottlenecks as well. Regulatory bottlenecks are also existing, right? Because of these regulatory bottlenecks, these startups require a number of permissions. They require a huge number of permissions, and compliance burden is also another major problem that these startups have been facing. And apart from that, the exit barriers for these new startups also discouraged innovation that has been coming up in the startup ecosystem. So therefore there is a need to reduce this regulatory burden on the startups, and there is also a need to improve the ease of doing business when it comes to the startup ecosystem, and that plays a very important role in reviving the Indian startup ecosystem. So what should be the way forward? Now if you look at this particular image, the most of Indian startups are concentrated in e-commerce sector, followed by fintech and consumer services, right? So around 60 to 65 percentage of Indian startups are just concentrated in these areas alone. So they are not going into a deep tech based startups. They are not going into technologies like space and electric vehicles, semiconductors, right? So they are less incentivized to invest in all these different sectors, right? So what should be the way forward in this context? Very simple thing, we need to invest in research and development. So as of now, 0.64 percentage of India's GDP is spent on research and development, and because of that reason we have poor R&D infrastructure all across the country. So we have a poor R&D infrastructure all across the country, right? So for example, if you look at the developed countries like US, Japan, they are spending around 2% of their GDP on research and development on an average. So therefore there is a significant need to substantially increase India's spending on research and development. And apart from that, the industry and academia collaborations are also very important. Industry and academia collaborations will play a very important role, right? So when we talk about the industry and academia collaborations, industry would get the skilled workforce or workforce which can actually understand the demands of the industry at that point of time, right? So it will be mutually beneficial because academia can provide a skilled workforce to the industry, and industry can also readily provide employment to the students who are just passing out from the colleges, right? So therefore it is mutually beneficial, and it emphasizes on the industry and academia collaborations, and that is very important. So therefore in this context, research and development funding, India should actually spend more than 1% of its GDP on research and development. So this is the one thing where it can actually support the startup ecosystem which is based on deep technology, and apart from that, there is a need to build centers of excellence, right? So build centers of excellence in new and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, quantum technologies, and even the semiconductors, right? So these are some emerging technologies, and there is a need to build centers of excellence in these emerging technologies. And apart from that, skilling is also another very important area that we should focus on. Skilling, upskilling, and reskilling, and revamping the STEM education, science, technology, engineering, medicine education, to train students in these emerging technologies is also very, very important for a country like India. Apart from that, there is a need to encourage long-term venture capitalist funding in India, right? So we have discussed that venture capitalists are conservative. Venture capitalists are conservative in India, and venture capitalists are not ready to invest in startups which give results in the long term, and they are also not ready to invest in any startup in India. So that is also another factor which has been which has been resulting in the concentration of most of the startups in few sectors alone in India. And similarly, we should also focus on the regulatory aspect, regulatory and compliance aspect, and it is very, very important for establishing startups. We need to promote ease of doing business, for the startup, for a healthy startup ecosystem in India, and simplify the intellectual property rights, fast track the patent approvals for these new startups, and also remove the existing bottlenecks in funding the foreign direct investments in the startup ecosystem. So all these measures have to be undertaken. So once we are able to undertake all these different measures, then we will be able to perform better, and we can also bridge the gap between the Indian startup ecosystem and the Chinese startup ecosystem, and we can also start to see more startups in the deep technologies, startups which are based on technology, startups which are based on innovation as well. Right, I hope you have understood this. And next very important topic is about the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, wages and the income security. So there is an article in the Indian Express newspaper about the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and there is a need to increase the overall wages of the workers of Manrega. So therefore it will provide income security, it will provide livelihood security, it will also enhance the bargaining powers of the workers of Narega. Right, so what is the context? So the context of this particular article is that recently a parliamentary standing committee, so that has reviewed Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and this parliamentary standing committee on MG Narega has recommended that there should be a revision and also uniformity in Manrega wages, because there is a rising cost of living as well as inadequate inflation indexation in rural areas, and that is why the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Rural Development has recommended that there is a need to rise wages of the Manrega workers, because the cost of living has been increasing, and apart from the cost of living, the governments have not indexed the wages of Manrega to the existing inflationary trends. Right, now what is Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act? So it was passed by the Parliament in the year 2005. Right, so it has provided the statutory right to work, and MG Narega provide 100 days of wage labor, 100 days of wage labor to every rural household who is seeking work, who is ready to work the unskilled manual labor work. Right, so it actually provides 100 days of unskilled manual work to every rural household who seek work in a rural area. Right, so in fact it ensures income security, it ensures livelihood security, livelihood security, and it would result in women empowerment. So how it would result in women empowerment? Because around 1/3 of the beneficiaries of Manrega scheme should be women. 1/3 of the beneficiaries of Manrega schemes should be women. However, it is expected that more than 50% of the Manrega beneficiaries are women, thereby making women financially independent, financially self-sufficient, and it would result in the women empowerment in rural areas as well. And schemes like Manrega plays a very important role in crisis situations. For example, during COVID-19 pandemic, what happened that we have observed reverse migration as a trend from the urban areas to rural areas. However, Manrega has provided employment for those migrants in the rural areas, thereby providing income support and income security during the distress days. And in fact, it also substantially increase the bargaining powers of the rural labor, and their agricultural wages can also be increased. I hope you knew about this, how it can actually increase the bargaining power, because the rural laborers have an alternative, right? So they have an alternative, and in fact the government has been providing decent wages. And on the other hand, if if any farmer has been asking them to work in his field, then certainly the workers would demand higher wages, because already under Manrega the government has been providing them the decent wages, not 400, I think around 300 rupees that these workers have been getting, right? So apart from that, it can also address the distress migration, right? Distress migration from rural areas to urban areas. So this is one of the most common phenomenon that we observe in India. Particularly there is usually migration from rural areas to urban areas for work, right? Most of them are settled as a construction workers, working as a construction workers in urban areas in poor living conditions. However, Manrega plays a very important role in arresting this migration, distress migration from rural areas to the urban areas. So about Manrega scheme, we'll try to understand this and its importance as well. Now, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act was passed by the Parliament in the year 2005. So as I have already told you, that it ensures, or it provides 100 days of waged employment, 100 days of waged employment for rural households every year. For example, there are some areas which are considered as drought affected areas or drought prone areas or distressed areas. So in those areas, 150 days of work employment or waged work would be provided to those people, right? So in fact, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is considered as the largest employment program, all across the world, because around 25 crore people have been registered under the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And because of that reason, it is being said that Manrega is the largest employment generating program all across the world. And we have already discussed other benefits of Manrega, that the poverty alleviation is one such benefit under the Manrega program. So apart from poverty alleviation, so what are the other benefits? It provides income security, it provides livelihood security, and it ensures women empowerment in rural areas. It arrests distress migration, right? So it arrests distress migration from rural areas to the urban areas. And in fact, it also strengthen the bargaining powers of the rural laborers. And in fact, the rural population can be able to invest in their health and education as well. So whenever any question is asked in your mains examination about the Manrega program, you need to mention all these points along with the relevant data and examples. You need to mention all these different points, and that's how you can actually get good marks, right? So poverty alleviation tool, because Manrega actually provides a safety net for the rural poor, especially during the crisis. So if they face any crisis, it actually provides a safety net. It provides income security, it provides livelihood security, and we have already seen this during the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And similarly, Manrega scheme could strengthen the rural infrastructure. Particularly, it promotes the natural resource management, or it would result in the community resources creation. So it create community resources, right? Because community resources in the sense that it do works like irrigation infrastructure, creation of irrigation infrastructure, and recharge of the groundwater tables. It also plays a very important role in connectivity. And apart from that, recently there are attempts to link Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act with agriculture in rural areas. So thereby it could be a win-win situation for both workers and the farmers as well, right? So therefore it plays a very important role in strengthening the rural infrastructure as well. And in fact, MG Narega is considered as a wage growth multiplier. It is also considered as wage growth multiplier. Now, how it is considered as a wage growth multiplier? Because as I have already explained to you, that Manrega will improve the bargaining powers, of the farmers, all the laborers. So since it increases the bargaining powers of the laborers, so there is a high probability that their agricultural wages could also be increased further, right? So Manrega is actually a tool for wage growth multiplier in the rural areas, right? So there are some other important facts that are being provided here. So Manrega has been started in the year 2005, and the cost sharing between the center and states is 90-10, and in fact a target group, so it is open to all rural households and priority for women, because around 1/3 of the wage seekers under Manrega should be women, and it will be implemented by Ministry of Rural Development. So this ministry is very important, and the objective of Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act is that it provides 100 days of wage employment for the rural households. So you should have to remember this. And in fact, how Narega wage rates are decided, right? So we'll try to for example, if government has been providing 320 rupees per day as a wage under MG Narega program, so how this 320 rupees of wage is fixed by the government? So there are number of ways this wage is actually fixed, right? So MG Narega Act that was passed by the Parliament in the year 2005, and in this very same legislation there is a section called Section 6 Subclause 1. Section 6 Subclause 1. Now in this, as per this particular section, the central government can actually notify independent wage rates, right? So if central government wanted to notify the independent wage rates, then under Section 6 Clause 1 can actually declare the independent wage rates for the Manrega workers. So it actually empowers the central government to do so. The center can actually set Narega wage regardless of state's minimum wage. For example, imagine that state's minimum wage is 250 rupees and center can declare 320 rupees. Now imagine that state's minimum wage is 320 rupees, then also the center can come forward and declare the minimum wages to be 250 rupees. So irrespective of state's minimum wages, the center can actually declare the independent wage rates under Section 6 Clause 1 of the Manrega Act 2005. And secondly, there is a Section 6 and Subclause 2. And Section 6 Clause 2 states that a state minimum agriculture wages apply in the absence of central notification. So imagine that if there is no central notification with respect to the prices or with respect to the wages for the Manrega workers, so in that case what actually happens is that state minimum wages would be applicable, and this is the default provision. So default provision in the sense that imagine that the central government has not declared wage rate for the Manrega, then the minimum wages that are in place by the state governments would become a default mechanism, right? So apart from that, the historical cap was even introduced in the year 2009, right? So historical cap was introduced to reduce fiscal burden on because of the Narega wages, and Narega wages were capped at 100 rupees, right? So 100 rupees were the Narega wages to reduce the fiscal burden on the government. And indexation to consumer price index agriculture labor since 2011 with the base year as 2009, and in fact the wage is revised annually based on the consumer price index for agricultural laborers. And apart from that, for example, imagine that the central government has notified that Manrega workers wage is 300 rupees, and if the government of any state, for example the state government of Tamil Nadu, wanted to give more wages or increase the wages, the state government of Tamil Nadu can give 350 rupees. However, the extra 350 rupees burden will be borne by the respective state governments, right? So this is how the Manrega wages can actually be decided, right? So states may top up wages over the center's notified rate. A few states voluntarily pay the gap between the center's rate as well as their minimum wages. So you can also go through some important features of the Manrega program, right? So apart from that, there are certain suggestions which are provided by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. So we'll just look into those suggestions which are provided by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Rural Development, particularly with respect to Manrega. So it has suggested that there is a need to link wages with the minimum wages of the state governments. For example, state government minimum wage is 320 rupees. The center should also ensure that whatever price it notifies, it should be aligned with the state's minimum wages. And in fact, in one of the judgment, the Supreme Court has also held that the case was Sanjit Roy versus the state of Rajasthan 1983. So in this particular case, the Supreme Court has held that not paying minimum wages to any worker is considered as a forced labor, and because of that reason, if state government has a minimum wages, then the central government should also notify Manrega wages as per the minimum wages of the respective state government. And in fact, there is also a need to switch over to the consumer price index rural areas, right? So because the consumer price index rural area, so this actually reflects the actual price trends and even the consumption patterns of all rural workers, right? So there is a need to adopt a national floor wage policy, a uniform policy of providing wages, common wages or similar wages to all the workers across the country. This is another recommendation has been made by the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Rural Development, right? So there is a need to create a wage floor that is 375 rupees or revised for inflation for national parity and justice, as it was already recommended by Anup Satpathy Committee to ensure consistency across states. For example, now I would like to tell you, for a state like Jharkhand, minimum wage would be 220 rupees, and for a state like Tamil Nadu, the minimum wage would be 320 rupees, right? So if there is such a difference in Manrega wages, for example, Manrega workers in the state of Jharkhand are getting 220 rupees, but Manrega workers in the state of Tamil Nadu are getting 320 rupees. So it would result in, injustice, right? So it would result in injustice. So therefore, there is a need for a common and uniform floor wage policy all across the country that was recommended by Anup Satpathy Committee to ensure consistency across all states. And another major problem that is existing with respect to Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee scheme is that a delay in the payment of wages. So this is the main problem, right? So even though the workers, the people are working as part of the Manrega, their wages are actually delayed, right? So therefore, there is a need to ensure timely and transparent payments to the Manrega workers. For that, there is a need to fix digital delays and payment related bottlenecks through a better fund flows and even the grievance redressal. Example, the wage arrears of 12,219 crore pending in 2025 have crippled scheme implementation in several states. Right, so key features of the Manrega: right to work, unemployment allowance would be provided if the respective governments not able to provide work for work seekers within the 15 days, and women's participation, 1/3 of the beneficiaries must be women, and work radius within the 5 kilometers from the of the village or from the place where they are living, and work site facilities are also provided to the Manrega workers. Right, so next important topic is that recently Trump administration has decided that coal would be considered as a critical mineral. Now, why it is in news? So it is in news because coal is considered as it releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Coal is a fossil fuel. When we burn coal to produce energy or electricity, it releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases would result in global warming and the climate change. Right, so as of now, countries have been making a transition towards the renewable form of energy resources or the nuclear fuel, but it is certainly alarming that countries again switching back to coal, and that would further increase the concerns with respect to global warming and associated issues, and countries may not be able to keep the global temperature rise 2 degrees Celsius below the pre-industrial level, and that could have worst consequences. Right, so in April 2025, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order. Right, so this executive order says that to classify coal, particularly the coking coal used in steel making, as both critical mineral as well as the critical material. So this executive order signed by Donald Trump has classified coal as a critical mineral and critical material. So under US Energy Act of 2020, a critical mineral is one essential for the economic and national security, and also having a valuable supply disruptions, or it is vulnerable to supply disruptions. Right, so this is what is the critical mineral. So critical mineral has been defined by US Energy Act 2020, and this particular act has defined critical mineral as one which is essential for economic and national security, and it is also vulnerable to the supply disruptions. And in fact, this is very, very important for your prelims perspective. Right, so there are different types of coal has been given, such as peat, lignite, bituminous, and anthracite coal. Right, so anthracite coal is high quality coal, but lignite is a poor quality coal. Lignite is a poor quality coal, and anthracite is a very high quality coal. So if we can arrange coal right from peat to anthracite, right, so in fact it is an increasing heat and carbon content. So with increasing heat and increasing carbon content, the quality of the coal will also increase. With increasing moisture content, the quality of coal starts reducing. Right, so please go through these different forms of coal, because this is very, very important. So peat coal, lignite coal, bituminous coal, and even anthracite coal. So India also having the reserves of anthracite coal, but they are very, very limited. So anthracite coal is highly desirable fuel because of its high heat content and low sulfur content, and in fact supplies are limited in most of the areas. And in fact, this bituminous coal is also known as soft coal, and it is extensively used as a fuel because of its high heat content and larger supplies, and normally it has a high sulfur content. But anthracite coal has a low sulfur content. Right, so why this move by the US administration, particularly US President Donald Trump, particularly at a time when the world has been making a rapid transition into the renewable form of energy, particularly at a point of time where we have concerns with respect to the global warming, right? So the strategic energy rationale is the major reason for this particular move by the US, because coal is actually considered as a reliable source of energy for many countries. Wind energy, solar energy, they are not a reliable form of energy, they are intermittent in nature. But coal is perceived as a stabilizing the power grid, especially with rising energy demand from artificial intelligence driven centers in many countries. So there is no doubt that there is a significant rise in energy demand from number of countries. There's a huge increase in the demand of energy. So therefore, in order to meet the energy demand and the inability of the renewable sources of energy to meet this demand has resulted in countries switching over to coal again. And apart from that, the renewable sources like wind energy, solar energy are variable in nature. So variable in the sense that they are intermittent. We cannot have a reliable supply of power from these sources. So because of that reason, they are less suitable for continuous power supply. So we cannot ensure a continuous power supply from renewable sources such as wind and solar energy. However, in contrast to these wind and solar energy, coal-fired power plants offer a reliable baseload capacity, right? So they can actually offer a reliable capacity of energy generation, and with that we can actually meet the demand for energy. And in fact, as per this executive order that has been signed by US President Donald Trump, coal is abundant in nature and it is also cost effective, right? So there is a huge amount of coal is existing and it is also cost effective compared to the other renewable form of energy resources. So thereby we can actually meet the increasing electricity demands, because there is a growth in artificial intelligence technologies and domestic manufacturing, and that has substantially increased the demand for electricity, and we can meet the demand for electricity through coal-fired power plants. And in fact, these sentiments actually echo the broader global trends, with coal usage rising in countries like India and China for their grid balancing because of the intermittent nature of renewable energy resources such as wind and solar energy, right? So there are some details with respect to cooking coal have been given here, right? So you can go through it. And cooking coal is actually used in steel manufacturing, and in fact when we talk about the global production of this cooking coal, China is the largest producer of cooking coal with 62% of production. And apart from that, we should also talk about the regulatory rollbacks and industrial impact of bringing back coal as a major form of energy resource. And when we talk about this, it has actually, this executive order has removed the mandates for emission control technologies in coal power plants and cut the bureaucratic hurdles around the coal mining permits as well. So this further results in easing the restrictions, regulations around the coal mining and also the power plants which use coal to produce energy. And in fact, steps are intended to revive the coal sector in US, because that has saw a share in the US energy mix 40%. So in the year 2014, total energy mix, 40% of the energy is produced from coal alone, but by the year 2024 it has been reduced to 15%. However, this executive order essentially aimed at reviving coal as the main source of energy generation. Thereby they can meet the demand of increasing demand for energy and electricity because of the AI powered centers and reviving manufacturing in US. And in fact, such deregulation is being seen as a boon for industries such as steel industry, cement industry, because these industries primarily rely upon the coking coal, and it would also help them cutting their costs, right? So it would help them cutting costs for these respective industries. However, the idea of strengthening domestic supply chains and also reducing the import dependence on coal, it is also a notion. It has been getting a traction in many countries like India, because Niti Aayog has also recommended that there is a need to classify coal as a critical mineral, right? So like how US has classified coal as a critical mineral, Niti Aayog has also suggested that coal should be classified as a critical mineral, right? So in fact, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IEA, so this International Energy Agency forecasts that a data center electricity usage could double by 2026, right? And apart from that, companies like Google, Microsoft are switching over to the nuclear energy contracts. And in fact, the government is exploring all stable and scalable options, including coal, to produce more energy to meet the growing energy demand in their respective countries. And in fact, coal is being seen as a transitional fuel, and that can bridge the gap until large-scale energy storage solutions for renewables become commercially viable, right? So in fact, you can also go through the problems with Indian coal, non-coking coal, and the coking coal as well, right? So however, increased usage of coal would have serious environmental concerns, because coal is a carbon intensive fossil fuel, and when we burn coal, it would actually releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and greenhouse gases means global warming and climate change, right? So therefore, it would potentially increase the issues which are associated with the environment protection, climate change, and global warming, because coal is a carbon intensive fuel. And apart from that, countries may not be able to achieve the net zero targets that they have already put in place if they switch over to the resources like coal. For example, India has a net zero target by 2070. So because of the intermittent nature of the renewable fuels, if India switches over to the coal again, India may not be able to achieve the net zero target. And apart from that, India may not be able to achieve its nationally determined contributions as well, right? I hope you have understood, and that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like our lecture, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.